The encrypted satellite uplink pinged twice at 2:47 a.m., not from a cartel safehouse, not from a border crossing, but from the private residential compound of a sitting federal immigration judge in the River Oaks district of Houston. NSA Signals Intelligence flagged it immediately. The transmission lasted 9 seconds, long enough to send coordinates, long enough to warn someone, and long enough to trigger what would become the most explosive judicial corruption takedown in American immigration enforcement history. Special Agent Carla Dominguez stood in the mobile command unit watching the intercept replay for the third time. She turned to her team lead and said only this: "Pull the ground teams back. We're not raiding a cartel outpost. We're raiding a federal judge." But what they found 11 feet beneath that mansion didn't just expose one corrupt official. It exposed an entire shadow immigration court operating inside the American justice system, and the Sinaloa Cartel had been running it for 7 years. To understand how we got here, we need to go back 14 months to the night a desperate father walked into an FBI field office with a folder full of documents he had stolen from his own employer. He was a maintenance technician at a private residential estate. What he handed over that night would eventually bring down 129 people across 5 federal agencies. 9:14 p.m., Houston FBI field office. The man who walked through the door refused to give his name for 40 minutes. He kept looking at the entrance like he expected someone to walk in behind him. When he finally spoke, he said his daughter had been detained by ICE 9 months earlier despite having valid asylum paperwork. Her case had been assigned to a specific immigration judge. Within 72 hours, her file had been sealed, her hearing canceled, and she had been transferred to a facility that didn't appear in any federal database. He had spent 6 months trying to find her. He had spent another 3 months gathering evidence from the estate where he worked. The estate belonged to the Honorable Marcus Elijah Thornton, federal immigration judge, 18 years on the bench, over 4,000 deportation cases adjudicated. And according to the documents this father had just handed over, direct financial ties to a Sinaloa Cartel human trafficking operation that had been moving people across the Texas border for nearly a decade. The folder contained photographs of construction deliveries to the judge's property, underground construction, concrete, ventilation equipment, soundproofing materials, things you don't need for a wine cellar, things you need for something you want to keep hidden. Within 48 hours, DHS analysts cross-referenced those delivery manifests with known cartel construction contractors. Every single company traced back to the same shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, the same shell corporation that had been flagged in 3 separate DEA investigations over 5 years. Investigations that had all been quietly closed before reaching prosecution. Someone had been protecting this network from the inside, and the evidence suggested that someone sat on the federal bench. But here's what the FBI didn't know yet. Judge Thornton wasn't operating alone. He was part of a system that had been designed by someone with access to every immigration enforcement database in the country, someone who knew exactly when raids were coming, exactly which cases to dismiss, and exactly how to make people disappear into a trafficking pipeline that stretched from Honduras to Houston. The architect of that system was still unknown, and finding them was about to become the most dangerous investigation the FBI had ever conducted inside its own government. 3:47 a.m. Tuesday morning, 6 FBI tactical teams positioned around Judge Thornton's River Oaks estate. Ground-penetrating radar had confirmed the underground structure 3 days earlier. 11 feet down, reinforced concrete, multiple rooms, a ventilation system drawing power from a separate grid that didn't appear on any city utility records. The breach order came at 3:45. 2 minutes later, agents were inside the main residence. Judge Thornton was detained in his study. He was wearing a robe. He was holding a glass of scotch. He didn't say a word. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting this moment for a long time. The underground entrance was hidden behind a custom bookshelf in the private library. Hydraulic mechanism. Biometric lock requiring fingerprint and retinal scan. When they overrode the system and descended the concrete stairs, what they found stopped the lead agent in his tracks. a fully operational detention facility, 12 holding cells, medical examination room, interview chamber with recording equipment, and a tunnel system extending 400 meters east, emerging beneath an industrial warehouse that had been listed as abandoned for 6 years. 23 people were recovered from those cells that night, 14 women, 6 men, 3 children under the age of 12. All of them had pending immigration cases. All of them had been reported as voluntarily departed by official court records. All of them had been held underground for periods ranging from 3 weeks to 11 months. The medical examination room contained equipment consistent with organ compatibility testing. The FBI immediately contacted Homeland Security Investigations and requested a joint task force with medical trafficking expertise. What they suspected was happening in that underground facility was beyond anything they had encountered in domestic operations. But the holding cells and the medical equipment weren't the most disturbing discovery. The most disturbing discovery was the server room. 4:52 a.m., FBI cyber forensics team breached the underground server room. Military-grade encryption, air-gapped systems, and a direct fiber optic connection running to an endpoint that analysts couldn't immediately identify. It took 6 hours to crack the first layer of security. When they did, what loaded onto the screen made 3 veteran agents request immediate reassignment from the case. The server contained a complete parallel case management system. Every immigration case that had passed through Judge Thornton's courtroom for 7 years had been duplicated into this shadow database. But the shadow records told a different story than the official ones. Cases marked as voluntary departure in federal records were marked as transfer to processing in the shadow system. Cases marked as asylum granted were marked as asset acquisition pending. Cases marked as deportation completed were marked as product delivered. The cartel hadn't just corrupted an immigration judge. They had built an entirely separate immigration court operating inside the legitimate one. And Judge Thornton had been routing specific cases, young women, unaccompanied minors, individuals with no family contacts in the United States, into this shadow system for 7 years. The financial records showed payments totaling $4.7 million deposited into offshore accounts linked to Judge Thornton's family trust. But those payments represented only a fraction of the operation's value. Analysts estimated the human trafficking pipeline facilitated by this shadow court had generated over $89 million in cartel revenue across the operation's lifespan. And Judge Thornton wasn't the only judicial official in the system. 6:15 a.m., the task force expanded. What started as a single-target investigation became Operation Shadow Court. The server records contained references to 4 other judicial officials across southeast Texas, 2 immigration judges, 1 federal magistrate, 1 state appellate court judge. All of them had case patterns matching Thornton's. All of them had financial anomalies flagged by Treasury Department algorithms. All of them had been systematically routing specific immigration cases away from legitimate processing and into the cartel's shadow system. Simultaneous raids hit 11 locations across Harris, Fort Bend, Galveston, and Brazoria counties. At a luxury condominium complex in the Galleria district, ICE tactical teams detained a senior cartel coordinator who had been living under a false identity as a legitimate immigration attorney. His client list included 340 individuals who had all passed through the shadow court system. At an industrial facility near the Port of Houston, DHS agents discovered a secondary detention site. 31 people recovered. Documentation indicating they were scheduled for transport to facilities in Monterrey and Guadalajara within 72 hours. At a converted medical clinic in Pasadena, investigators found evidence of organ harvesting operations, surgical equipment, tissue typing records, and transportation logs showing shipments to 3 hospitals in Mexico that had previously been flagged by international health authorities for trafficking-related medical procedures. The scope of what they had uncovered was expanding by the hour. But the central question remained unanswered. Who had designed this system? Who had the access, the intelligence, and the authority to build a parallel judicial infrastructure inside the American immigration court system? The answer came at 11:47 a.m. when analysts finally cracked the administrative layer of the shadow court server. The system administrator credentials belonged to someone who had never appeared in any cartel investigation, someone whose name made the room go silent, someone who had spent 23 years building exactly the kind of access required to construct this operation. Deputy Assistant Director of Immigration Court Operations, Rachel Moreno-Vance, the woman who had personally implemented the digital case management system used by every immigration court in the United States, the woman who had designed the security protocols, the woman who knew exactly how to build a shadow system that would never be detected by internal audits. She had been recruited by the Sinaloa Cartel 9 years earlier. She had spent those 9 years quietly constructing the infrastructure that allowed 5 corrupt judges to operate a parallel immigration court. She had personally approved the security clearances of 12 cartel-connected contractors who had built the underground facilities. And she had systematically blocked 3 internal investigations that had come close to exposing the operation. Rachel Moreno-Vance was arrested at her office at 2:14 p.m. She was calm, she was cooperative, and she said one thing that made the arresting agents immediately contact the Director of Homeland Security. She said, "There are 6 other cities. You found Houston. You haven't found the others." By end of day Tuesday, Operation Shadow Court had produced 129 arrests, 8.1 tons of narcotics seized from connected cartel distribution points, $43 million in assets frozen, 89 trafficking survivors recovered from detention sites across the Houston metropolitan area. The judicial corruption component alone had taken down 5 judges, 12 court administrators, 8 immigration attorneys, and 23 ICE and Border Patrol officers who had been facilitating the transfer of detainees into the shadow system. The law enforcement component had dismantled 6 cartel distribution cells, 3 weapons caches containing military-grade equipment, and a financial network that had laundered over $120 million through Houston real estate over 7 years. But the investigation wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because what Rachel Moreno-Vance told federal prosecutors in her first interview painted a picture of something far larger than anyone had imagined. The Houston Shadow Court was a pilot program, a proof of concept. The cartel had spent 7 years perfecting the model in Houston before expanding to other cities. Dallas had been operational for 3 years, Phoenix for 2, Atlanta for 18 months. Chicago had just gone live 6 months earlier. Each city had its own corrupt judicial official at the center. Each city had its own shadow case management system running parallel to the legitimate courts. Each city had its own underground detention infrastructure. And each city was routing specific immigration cases into the same continental trafficking pipeline. The Sinaloa Cartel hadn't just infiltrated the American immigration system. They had replicated it, built their own version of it, and staffed it with American officials who had been corrupted, compromised, or coerced into participation. The blueprint recovered from the Houston server room contained operational plans for 8 additional cities. The cartel's goal was a nationwide shadow immigration court system operating invisibly inside the legitimate one, controlling which cases received asylum, controlling which people were deported, controlling which individuals disappeared into trafficking networks. All of it managed by corrupted American officials using American government systems. That's what 129 people were arrested for protecting. That's what 8.1 tons of drugs were funding. That's what had been operating beneath a federal judge's mansion in one of Houston's wealthiest neighborhoods. And that's what federal investigators are now racing to dismantle in 6 other American cities before the cartel can relocate its operations and disappear the evidence. The father who walked into the FBI field office 14 months ago got his daughter back. She was recovered from the underground facility beneath Judge Thornton's estate. She had been held for 9 months. She had been scheduled for transfer to a facility in Mexico 3 days after the raid. She asked her father one question when she saw him. She asked if she was actually in America. She didn't know anymore. In Harris County alone, the shadow court system had processed over 600 immigration cases into the cartel trafficking pipeline across 7 years. Federal investigators believe the majority of those individuals are still missing. International recovery operations are ongoing, but the trafficking networks they were sold into span 3 continents. The likelihood of finding most of them is small. Some of them were children. Some of them were families. Some of them were people who came to this country believing the American court system would protect them. Instead, the American court system sold them. That's what corruption looks like when it reaches the judicial branch. It doesn't just steal money. It doesn't just move drugs. It erases people. It makes human beings disappear into systems designed to exploit them. And it does it wearing a black robe, sitting behind a bench, wielding the authority of the United States government. 5 judges did this. 5 people who swore an oath to uphold justice. 5 people who had the power to protect the most vulnerable individuals in our legal system. They chose money instead. They chose the cartel instead. They chose to become the thing they were supposed to protect people from. Operation Shadow Court exposed the largest judicial corruption case in American immigration history. But it also exposed something else. It exposed how vulnerable our systems are to people who are supposed to protect them. It exposed how long corruption can operate when it sits at the top instead of the bottom. And it exposed how many people can disappear before anyone notices that the system designed to help them has become the system designed to destroy them. The 6 other cities are still being investigated. The identities of the corrupted officials in those jurisdictions are still being confirmed. The scope of how many people have been trafficked through the nationwide shadow court network is still being calculated. Federal prosecutors estimate it will take 3 years to fully unwind what the cartel built, 3 years to identify every corrupt official, 3 years to trace every victim, 3 years to understand exactly how deep this operation penetrated into the American justice system. If you made it this far, you understand something most people never will. Corruption doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. It sits in positions of trust and uses that trust as a weapon. It processes paperwork. It signs orders. It makes decisions that determine whether people live free or disappear forever. And sometimes the people making those decisions have already been bought. The only defense against that kind of corruption is attention, exposure, refusing to look away when the evidence points somewhere uncomfortable, refusing to believe that the system is too strong to be compromised, refusing to accept that the people in power are automatically the people who deserve to be there. This story happened. These arrests happened. These victims were real, and the investigation into the other 6 cities is ongoing right now. What they find in Dallas, Phoenix, Atlanta, Chicago, and the other locations, that story is still being written, but the pattern is already clear. The cartel didn't just infiltrate America. They built a parallel America, one that looks exactly like ours from the outside, one that operates completely differently on the inside, one that exists to serve their interests while wearing the uniform of our institutions. That's the real story of what they found beneath a federal judge's mansion in Houston. Not just a tunnel, not just drugs, not just corruption. A blueprint for replacing the American justice system with something designed to exploit the people it's supposed to protect. They almost succeeded. In Houston, they operated for 7 years before anyone found them. 7 years of cases, 7 years of victims, 7 years of a shadow court operating in plain sight. How many other cities have been running longer? How many other systems have been compromised deeper? How many other people have disappeared into networks we haven't discovered yet? Those questions don't have answers. Not yet. But someone is looking for them. And now you know to look too.